Hello everybody, my name is Niall. I'm the defender of AG Grid, and I'm going to talk to you about the frameworks that are being used in enterprise at the moment. When I say frameworks, I mean whether it's Angular, whether it's React, etc. Now, if I wanted to find out what frameworks are being used, I could go to NPM and see which ones are being downloaded. I'd see that React is actually downloaded about 3 times more than Angular, but that's not representative of the enterprise. Far more people use these frameworks for building websites than they do for enterprise. So it's not actually true to say that React is 3 times more popular. So what this talk is about is what's actually happening in the enterprise, what's happening in finance. So before we look at the numbers for finance, let's look at the numbers for what's actually happening in the world. At the top, it's basically all about React, Angular, and Vue, and then AngularJS, which is the old version of Angular. It's like the zombie Angular. Polymer is interesting. It's growing slightly, but it's got a very, very little market share. But there's a bit of a story about web components, and I'm going to come back to that later. So taking the top 4, putting that into a pie chart, looks like this. So globally, for websites, where all these frameworks are used, React is kind of taken over. It's dominant. It's got more than half. The next after that is Angular, which is the new version of Angular with about 20%. And then we've got the zombie Angular and Vue with about 10% each. So is Angular dominant in finance? And is Vue really making an impact inside finance? Well, let's find out. So how am I going to find out? Well, as I said, I work for AG Grid. And AG Grid is being used across a lot of financial applications. So I'm going to sample our customers. Well, we know what our customers are using, and that's what I'm going to present. So one thing to note about AG Grid is if you're using AG Grid, you're building an enterprise application. That's a given. You're not building websites. So that makes this relevant. We've about 1,500 customers, and about half of them are actually in the financial sector, either banks or similar, or small product companies that then sell to banks. We've about 36,000 weekly downloads. That's, compared to the last slide, about 1/10 the number of downloads that Angular has. But when you think about we're only looking at enterprise applications here, that's a big sample set. And then the last one is important. We're framework agnostic. So these numbers, we don't prefer or have any bias towards any particular framework. So when people come to our website and they want to use AG Grid, we let them use whatever framework they want. We don't push them in any direction. Okay? So the numbers. It was tempting to start at number 5, then go to number 4, but this ain't X Factor, and I couldn't be bothered, so these are the numbers here. Right, so at the top, we've got the same 4, React, Angular, Vue, and Aurelia, and zombie Angular. Sorry, not Aurelia. We've got React, Angular, and Vue, and then a zombie Angular. And then at the bottom, let's discount these again. Vue is unfortunate. This time last year, I thought Vue was going to go some places. The guy who created this, Rob Eisenberg, he left the Angular team, set up Aurelia, but then he moved to Microsoft about 2 years ago. I thought maybe there's a play there. Microsoft are going to do something, but they didn't, and now he's left Microsoft since April and gone someplace else. So it really is not going anywhere. It's got 1% of the market, and it's not growing. Web components and Polymer are interesting, and again, I'll talk to them later. So at the moment, it's all about React, Angular, zombie Angular, and Vue. And it's kind of broken down like this. So this pie chart's a bit different to the previous one. React is about half the developers are using React, but it's not dominant. In second place, if you join the 2 Angulars together, about half the people are then using Angular. So as far as I'm concerned, from our customer base and from people building financial applications, it's pretty much split between React and Angular. So Angular has more of a bias when it gets to enterprise. I would guess that's because it's maybe strongly typed, more maybe familiar to people who are coming from C# or Java backgrounds. Vue was 10% in our last pie chart, but it's not as big in finance. Now, if anybody knows Vue, you might know that the guy who invented Vue, he speaks Chinese. He is actually Chinese, but he lives in New Jersey. He speaks Chinese. He did all the documentation for Vue in Chinese. Vue is big in China. Facebook and Google, they're actually blocked in China. So it's a bit of a rigged system. So that's where Vue got really big. Now, it started to make an imprint on the enterprise, but it's mostly on the non-enterprise that Vue's making a difference. As well as the stats, I can give you some feedback on the conferences that we go to. So we go to different conferences for the different frameworks. We do Vue, Angular, React conferences, and some things we took from it. The Vue conferences generally don't have enterprise developers, whereas the Angular and React conferences do have enterprise developers, which again supports the pie chart that we just saw. It's all about Angular and React. And then another point that we take from the conferences, Google actually makes an effort to engage with the community. When you go to the Google conferences, you can find the Google core team there, and they want to speak to us. Facebook, not so much. We found it tricky to actually speak to somebody from Facebook. But to be honest, having looked at the news recently, the fact that Facebook doesn't really care about its users isn't really a big surprise. Okay, web components. This one is interesting for me as well. Where do web components fit into it? Web components are supported by React, Angular, and Vue. Angular are really strong about web components, and they do think it's the future. React and Vue just support them. They're not both putting a big push onto it. Before I go to that slide. So with us, wouldn't it be great if AG Grid only had one flavor, and it was a web component? And therefore, all of these people building with different frameworks could just use our web component, and we wouldn't have to give an Angular version and a React version. Well, the truth is, we already have a web component version of AG Grid, and nobody uses it. So if you're an Angular developer, you could use our web component version, but nobody wants to. Same for React, but nobody wants to. React developers want things written in React. They'll only use components if they're written in React. It's not likewise for Angular developers. So I thought maybe 2 years ago when web components started coming out, that would be a good way for component vendors like ourselves to just have one version. But that's not how it's going. Web components aren't taking off in the way that they should be. We also have Polymer. Polymer isn't a fully fledged framework. And from their website, it sprinkles a bit of sugar over the standard web components. The bit of sugar that it sprinkles is data binding. So when you set an attribute, rather than it being a string, it'll pass in the Java object that attribute references. And that's all. It doesn't do any of the IOC or the other stuff. So even if you do use Polymer, you'll still need another framework if you want to do IOC, etc. That means, for me, who would use Polymer? Well, it's probably people that are building websites, that are not building complex applications, where they'll want to just drag a web component in, like a video player, and then just leave it. They won't be interested in building an application. So for me, I'm not sure if Polymer and web components will fit into the enterprise side, and our stats from what our users are asking for and what they're doing, that tells a similar story. Okay, and lastly, I'm going to be a bit brave here, and I'm not going to try and predict the future. I'll just maybe hint at it. So we know that JavaScript libraries change, and there hasn't been any big changes in the last year. Vue was the latest kind of shaker, and that came about 2 years ago. So basically, it's all about Angular and React, and I have a bit of a problem with that. And that is the reasoning behind these frameworks' existences. So Angular was created by Google for the purposes of controlling the searchable web. It's in their interest to make sure that the future web is still searchable by the Google search engine. That's why they're in this space, no other reason, okay? They might be helping us on the enterprise side, but that's secondary to them. Then you have Facebook with React. Now, their purposes for having React is it was built to run Facebook, no other reason, okay? Now, Facebook is a web page. It's like a news feed, a very highly active news feed. If you're building an app that's like a highly active news feed, then use React. But if you're not, I question if it's the right thing to be using in enterprise. So because these two frameworks are up here, I see it just being open for somebody to come along and design a framework right for enterprise. And I can already see disruptors entering the space for this to happen. The disruptors I see are JavaScript developers are getting better. They're maturing. People now have 5-6 years experience with Java developers, sorry, with JavaScript. I remember when I wrote Java, as I went through my first 5 or 10 years, I got far more better. Also, we've got C# and Java developers coming into the space. And you've also got cross-framework libraries like web components and Angular elements. That's where somebody will write a component in one framework and it'll be able to be used in a different framework. So because of all these things coming together, I can see changes. And then lastly, WASM, which is WebAssembly. It's going to be mentioned in 2 more talks later on today. And that's where you can have up to almost real-time code running inside the browser. So with all of these changes, I can see somebody challenging the current state with Facebook, with Angular and React controlling the market. And that's it. That's the state of the frameworks in JavaScript according to AG Grid. I hope you enjoyed listening.